if someone you're worried about, another country has a weapon that's difficult to defend against, I mean, you do have to ask the question: should I go ahead and defend against it, or find other ways to, get around it?
So I was hoping you could share with me, what is this technology?
Well, hypersonics, it means that it's a vehicle that's flying, and is flying very, very fast. Hypersonic means it's flying, the speed is much greater than the speed of sound, which is a little bit of an abstract idea. So for example, the slowest hypersonic vehicle flies at something like 3,500 miles per hour. So that's 50 times faster than you should be driving down the freeway, right? It's like a mile a second. If you can imagine an airplane flying a mile a second, that's pretty awesome, right? And so that's what hypersonics is: really, really fast flying vehicles. And they're used for a lot of different things. So some of it is like space exploration. Some of it is national security, sort of defense things. We don't have it today, but in the future might be passenger flight, getting from, I don't know, LA to Japan in a couple of hours instead of whatever it takes right now. So, so it's a really cool and exciting technology.
To go that fast, right? Can you do that at 14,000 feet? Do you have to be at a specific altitude?
Yeah, so, air flight is almost always about not having too much what we call drag force, but the force that slows you down. And so, you tend to fly pretty high, higher than you and I would fly normally, to keep the drag force down, so that it's economic, so that you wouldn't have to burn a huge amount of fuel to keep yourself going. So tends to be high up in the atmosphere. If you're coming back from space, so like when people come back from the International Space Station, that's an example of a hypersonic situation. So that's, so you're in space, right? That's really high. But even if you wanted to have a passenger aircraft, you would be flying much higher in the atmosphere than we do today. Yeah.
I actually got to talk, I think 3 weeks ago, with one of the astronauts that came back from Elon Musk, the SpaceX first ISS mission. And boy, was that cool, man. That guy was just next level type of person. So I was taking notes. It's how do I be like this guy?
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be an exceptional experience, right? And it's exceptional people that, in general, end up doing that kind of stuff.
So does the United States have this hypersonic technology?
Well, one of the sort of confusing things about hypersonics is it is several different things. And so, coming back from orbit, like you were talking there with the astronaut, that's one kind of hypersonics for space exploration. So yes, we have that, right? You're just talking to someone who's experienced hypersonic flight in that environment. For sort of the defense applications, that's kind of, so that means hypersonic missiles. It means, weapons that are flying very fast. I would say there's almost like an arms race going on right now between maybe China and Russia and the US in that space. And so the US is working hard to develop these kinds of things. And I would say that China and Russia already have hypersonic weapons in their arsenal. So it's an area of, active research and development around the world.
How quickly, if you go up to low Earth orbit, how quickly does the world spin?
How quickly does the
how many minutes per rotation if you're in the International Space Station in the Earth?
Oh yeah.
How many minutes for a full rotation?
I think it's about an hour and a half, something like that. Yeah.
So they can get a hypersonic missile up there and basically put it down wherever they want.
Yeah, that's right. So last year, I think in the fall, earlier this year, there was a report that China had launched a missile that had gone all the way around the world. And basically the message was they could reach out and touch anywhere with that system. So that was almost like a Sputnik moment. I don't think it's quite the same, but it certainly got the attention of a lot of people whose job it is to protect our country.
Right. Yeah, I think the difference between that and the Sputnik is, well, I mean, they deny the claim, right? Doesn't China deny it that they didn't
Yeah,
do it? Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So, but I think there's enough, there's no smoke. There's no smoke without fire, right? So I think there was enough reports that probably something happened.
Do you ever get into the defense side of things?
I do. So I've had a lot of interaction with the Air Force and other parts, Space Force these days. And, I work in a university and do research most of the time. But, what we research also has an impact in the end on these kinds of things. And actually, I mean, there's a lot of common overlap between the space exploration hypersonics and national security hypersonics. In the end, you're flying very fast. You need special kind of materials to build the vehicles out of. And so from a kind of science point of view, it's the same science, right? So it are similar science. Yeah.
It's interesting to watch these fields develop. Like when the private space company started happening, there's a really small pool of people that you could even potentially hire for that. But then as more private space companies get older and then there's more people involved and there's new expertise, and then, an early member of SpaceX goes and founds their company, and it just makes more people. Are we in like super early stages of hypersonic?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, I think that, when in my job, I talk to people in the government and industry, big companies all the time, and they're interested in university research, but they're probably, more interested in the people, right, in the human product of doing research in a university environment. There is a shortage of people. The space economy is growing, right, like crazy, and just in general, of course, the U.S. has kind of a shortage of STEM, educated workforce. And this is, maybe one of the newest examples. So, So, I mean, for me, I'm an aerospace engineering sort of professor. I mean, my students all get great jobs right away. So that's good. We just need more of them.
So do you do research like within the context of the university, or is that something separate you do? How does your job work?
Oh, yeah. So it's mostly done through the university. So, I write proposals to government agencies and industry with, new ideas of stuff to research. And some of them get funded. And so then that funding is used to support usually graduate students who do the research. And, it's really a powerful way to do this kind of business, because we're educating people while they're also, pushing forward the frontiers of science and engineering through their research. And so it's kind of a win-win. It's a good paradigm, I think.
What's the propulsion system of a hypersonic? Let's say what do you call it? Do you call it a hypersonic device? How do you refer to it with a sense of ambiguity?
Vehicle. Yeah, vehicle.
Okay, vehicle.
Yeah.
What's the propulsion system or like the fuel for a hypersonic vehicle?
Yeah, again, it partly depends on the application. So for the military stuff, what happens is you launch a vehicle on a big old rocket, and then the vehicle would separate from the rocket and then sort of fly in the atmosphere. And when it's flying in the atmosphere, it may or may not have a propulsion system. So if it does, it's a special thing called a scramjet, which is a supersonic combustion ramjet. But it's basically it's very interesting technology too. So it's an engine in which you're bringing in air, just like a jet engine you see on an airplane, and you're mixing in some propellant, some fuel, and burning it. But you're doing all of that at incredibly high speeds, not the 3,500 miles per hour, but maybe 1,000 miles per hour. So you're having to get all this burning and combustion done at very high speed. So some hypersonic vehicles have these scramjets that allows them to kind of cruise through the atmosphere. And then other systems, you just launch them on a big rocket and they basically glide down to wherever they're going.
So they often don't have propulsion systems on them. You have this other rocket. What's the fuel of the rocket that they're attached to?
Yeah, the fuel is usually some kind of solid propellant is what it's called. And I mean, there's different forms of that, but that's That's a technology that's been around forever. I mean, almost all the rockets that are launched use solid propellants.
So they use that tried and true system to get it up to speed and get it up to where it needs to be. And then often when they don't have like a scramjet, they're just, using the airflow to guide the missile.
Exactly. That's right. And yeah, no, that's okay. Yeah, the vehicle's good. Yeah, so another, I hadn't mentioned this before, another type of hypersonic vehicle, but it is a weapon, are these things called intercontinental ballistic missiles. Now, those things have been around, right? The Cold War, all the way back to the 50s, ICBMs, right? So ICBMs are hypersonic too. They get launched on an even bigger rocket, and they go up outside of the atmosphere into space and then come back down again, okay? So now these new hypersonic vehicles, one of the things that's different about them is they don't go all the way out into space. They fly in the atmosphere, and then they're what we call maneuverable. They can move around and go a lot of different places. And this makes them very difficult to defend against. An ICBM, it kind of follows Newton's laws of motion. That is, if you pick it up, it's going to follow just like a cannonball, right? It's going to follow a very predictable path. These new systems don't follow any kind of predictable path because they can maneuver all over the place. And so that means you have to track them all the way through their flight. If you're trying to defend against one, you have to track it all the way, and it's flying in a region of the atmosphere that we're not used to looking in. It's not in space. It's not where aircraft fly. It's somewhere in between. And that turns out to be a gap that we're not used to, kind of monitoring.
So yeah, let's talk about that. You would have to have a certain amount of satellites in orbit positioned correctly, because you couldn't wait for an hour and a half rotation, right? You would have to you'd have to be able to see the complete canvas all the time, right? And then monitor things as they move across. Do we have that technology today?
Well, we may have the technology, but we don't have, the system, right? So that this is what people in the U.S. are talking about for defending against hypersonic weapons of other countries, is some kind of space-based surveillance network. So we have I think we have the technology in terms of sensors and, linking it all up into a system. But to actually put all that stuff up in space, it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to take a few years for sure. It's an interesting question. If someone you're worried about, another country has a weapon that's difficult to defend against, and is going to be incredibly expensive to defend against, you do have to ask the question: should I go ahead and defend against it, or find other ways to, get around it? And that's, I'm sure people in the Pentagon and so on are having those conversations.
We should just take from like the cosmetics budget.
Yeah, right. Wherever we can get it. Yeah.
How does the United States currently defend against this threat?
Well, we don't really have, an effective defense against it. There's a part of the Department of Defense called the Missile Defense Agency, MDA. That's their mission. Their mission is to defend the country against all types of missiles. And they have very effective means for slower weapons. And so the first line of defense would be, if somebody fired one today, the first line of defense would be to use what we have, right? Obviously, right? And it's not very clear how effective that would be. It's been reported that Russia has fired some hypersonic weapons in the Ukraine conflict. And so there's maybe opportunities to learn what's involved by, we're obviously monitoring all of that activity pretty carefully, I would expect. That's kind of a hand-waving, right, reply to your question there. People are very concerned that we do not have an effective defense against these systems today. Yeah.
I'm actually incredibly surprised that we don't have 24/7 real-time monitoring of every square inch of the surface of the Earth.
Yeah, we monitor a lot of things, but in the end, there's the surface of the Earth, but then there's all the layers of the atmosphere as well, right? And I mean, I know what you're saying, but if you're in space, I mean, an individual missile might be, I don't know, 10 feet long, 15 feet long. It's not tremendously big, right? And like I said, it's not just that you pick it up once. You have to be continuously tracking it. And even if we had some systems that could track, some missiles, if there was an all-out war, non-nuclear, with a peer nation, hypersonic weapons would be one element of just a big mixture of all different kinds of things that they would be throwing at us and we'd be throwing at them. I mean, it is, if it hopefully never gets to that, obviously, but if it does, it's going to be really messy.
I was listening to Ray Dalio this morning, and I follow this guy for the past 3 or 4 years, and he's always been fairly relaxed when he talks about the world cycles and the different attributes that drive behavior and debt cycles and such. And I just heard an interview this morning of him a couple days ago, and he's now just yeah, this is happening. and he explains it very clearly. I'm not going to attempt to explain. He's a very smart guy, but he explains it very clearly and provides historical evidence. This is not the first time this type of thing has happened. And then it's less about if it'll happen, but how it will play out. Right. And I'm curious because, I've been in technology my whole life, and all you need to do is take out a power station, or, you don't have to do a whole lot to cause chaos, right? Especially in the cities where there's a lot of people and every resource is shipped in and brought in. So for me, I mean, can you just imagine what would happen if we didn't have the internet for 72 hours?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. And it's the same kind of thing with space based assets. Like if we didn't have GPS, right? GPS went down, right? It's another good one. Yeah, I don't want to tempt fate, but it's in some ways it's kind of surprising there hasn't been an event of some kind.
Yeah. Well, if you look historically on the time period of the time between large wars, we're about due for one.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound sadistic or dark or anything, but that's just historical, right? So, yeah. Well, I think you and I stay positive. And discourse, conversations, I think that's the key to understanding other people and ultimately the key to cooperation.
Yeah, technology is also an opportunity for collaboration. I mean, obviously, relations with Russia are strained right now and never been particularly good. But the International Space Station is a really great example of where, a lot of the international community did come together for a common purpose, right? For science and research, and so I think that I agree with you 100% that finding different ways to engage with folks around the world or even in your own country that you don't necessarily agree with, right? Understanding common areas where you can collaborate and work together is super important.
It's almost kind of beautiful how the increase of technology, it empowers us to kill each other faster and more efficiently. At the same time, though, it brings us together. So it's like the scalpel. Is it a weapon or does it save your life? It's really kind of interesting because now, we can be talking and you can be in, let's pick a country that's acceptable. You be in Europe and everything's cool. Lights just bouncing around the world and we're just having a conversation. But yeah, and it enables businesses like mine. I do 90% of my interviews like this. And I think that's, I'm really grateful for technology. And my dad got the reason I'm into technology too, to talk a little bit about government and, NASA and all that type of stuff about how they play with public-private information and sharing. I'm very grateful to the U.S. Air Force because my dad was in a bad situation growing up. And at 18, he booked it to the Air Force as a way to get out of that. And he learned electronics, engineering and software. And his job, he told me 5 or 6 years ago when it got declassified, they put the first GPS system into the B-32 stealth bomber. That was his team.
Oh, wow.
That's pretty
awesome.
cool, right?
Yeah.
And because of that, and him getting that education and learning that trade and then teaching me, that has impacted my entire life, So I'm super grateful that these types of things exist. But to talk more, I'm curious, do you know about different technologies that NASA has given the, private sector?
Well, that's a good question. I think there's kind of an analogy of how the space industry is evolving right now to the way the aviation industry evolved back in the 40s and 50s. That way back then, NASA was not doing any space work at all. I was only sort of researching airplanes and airfoils and engines, and part of NASA's role, a very important part of NASA's role, is to support U.S. industry. Is to do the high risk, break the frontiers of research and technology, and then give that stuff by what they learn to U.S. industry, right? It's supposed to build up. And so that was very, very effective in making Boeing, aircraft company, the leading producer in the world of airplanes for a long time. And so that's what's been happening more recently in space. That I know, for example, NASA has helped companies with special materials needed to protect, again, in the hypersonic regime, protect capsules when they come back from space, like the Dragon for SpaceX and so on. And so companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and so on have benefited from, all the expertise that NASA has built up over the years. And sometimes people, kind of see that as some kind of competition between NASA and the U.S. companies, but it's absolutely not. It's truly a partnership. And I think what we'll see NASA evolve into is again finding those areas that are too risky, too expensive today for companies to take on, and to make progress with them and develop and mature whatever the technologies are, and then pass them on to commercial companies to make profit and to make products and so on. So I think it's a really great example of what NASA was set up to do, is what we're seeing play out.
How does the Space Force and NASA, how are they different?
Well, so NASA's main missions, like I just said, some of it is technology development, some of it is science, space science. Going to Mars and exploring the solar system and so on, right? So they're developing capabilities for industry, and they're doing science and research. Space Force, so one of the questions I often get asked is, what's the difference between Space Force and Space Command? That's a trickier question to answer. But what Space Force is supposed to do, of course, is protect American assets in space, right? And so whether that might be their own satellites, Space Force operates satellites. It might be NASA science satellites. It might be commercial satellites like SpaceLink and so on. So that's their job. So it's very much just like the other armed forces, right? The Navy protects American interests and assets on the seas, right? Space Force does it. Yeah, right. I mean, it's, if you put it that way, it's relatively simple to understand. I mean, how they do it, of course, is different from the Navy, but that's their basic mission.
Yeah. Is it? I don't know if it, because I watch movies, obviously, right? And then I get to talk to smart people, and sometimes they mix together. Do we have missiles in space that can shoot down, or is there something we're not allowed to have missiles in space? How does that go?
Right. So there's something called the Outer Space Treaty. It sounds kind of, like sci-fi, but the Outer Space Treaty basically says that space should only be used for peaceful purposes, and basically bans what we would call the weaponization of space, having weapons in space. And so there's more than 100 countries have signed up to that treaty. It was formulated in the late 60s. There was a lot of talk about that's way out of date and everything's changed since then and we need to, revisit it. It's true that it needs to be revisited, but I think it's very complicated. So the official policy of the U.S. government is not to put weapons in space because of the Outer Space Treaty. There's been reports again of several countries like destroying satellites, usually their own satellites, but not from space, rather, from launching something from the surface of the Earth and shooting down one of their own satellites, which on the one hand is a great demonstration of what they can do, but of course it creates a tremendous amount of space, debris, orbital debris, and messes everything up. So I hope there won't be too many more of those tests. But that's, I think people are becoming concerned about the weaponization, the militarization of space. The usual peer nations are all capable of putting stuff up there. And a spacecraft is a very, very flimsy thing. It doesn't have armor on it. I mean, you could smash a satellite to pieces with a hammer. Right? It's they're not hardened, and so they are very vulnerable. So again, lots of conversations I'm sure going on about how to protect U.S. assets in space. It's hard to do.
And I respect that that's the policy, but I don't think there's anything anyone could tell me that, like, even if the highest ranking general was in a private room with me, I wouldn't believe him if he told me that countries who can access space easily don't have weapons there. Like, it just, to me, I just know it's a human nature thing, and I would argue that all day. But I obviously want peace and whatnot, and we do this thing as humans, right? But yeah.
Well, and it's a continuation of the Cold War, right? Where basically it's just, one side has something, the other side counteracts it, maybe goes above it, and then it's a never-ending, escalation of, and so one of the things I always think looking back on the Cold War is it's amazing how well actually it worked. I mean, a lot of money was spent, yeah, but I mean, it did work. There was enough communication between the two sides that we got close a couple of times, but nothing bad actually did happen. And I think part of the concern today is that the U.S. doesn't have those same kinds of, like the hotline there used to be between Washington and Moscow. The president could call the hotline at any time to talk to the premier of the Soviet Union.
Now they just text. I think they use WhatsApp. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Now they just troll each other, right? Just like everybody
Twitter.
else. Yeah.
Oh,
yeah.
Man,
it's not quite the same, right?
No.
And I think the Ukraine situation kind of shows, right, that we're in an unstable point right now. And so going back to your point, I think the more communication and discussion and finding of common points is super important.
Yeah, no text-based communication, because like video calls only, FaceTime only, because the amount text gets interpreted so incorrectly. You see that a lot with companies that work online. Like we're a remote company, so we are really good about telling everybody, hey, if you see stuff, when you read text, you're applying often your own mood to it, right? Because you're in that context. So we're very aware at the company and talk about it a lot, about text communication. And if there's ever anyone feeling like rude or incorrect or something, like just pick up the phone and call them or do a video call or something. So yeah, definitely don't want text communication between world leaders.
Well, and even more so when it's not your native language, right? When you're putting text into, right? I mean, again, that's an extra layer of opportunity for misunderstanding, right?
Google Translate causes World War III.
Right. Yeah, we're laughing. I just hope that's...
I think, though, my thoughts like against a large global war would be that like life is pretty good, as far as the advancements we have and the creature comforts that we have as people. I think that motivates you to want to talk it out more, right?
Yeah, I think that's the yin and yang of globalization, right? That in the end, almost everybody has too much to lose, right? But to be honest, that's maybe what concerns me about Russia, right? Is they have a little bit less to lose, and right. But yeah, it's interesting to see where we are right now.
Absolutely. So, what else am I not? What am I not asking about hypersonic technology that I should be asking?
Well, I think it's a very exciting area for those of us who work on the research, because sometimes you have to go all the way down to looking at what individual molecules and atoms are doing. So it's really a lot of basic physics and chemistry that feed into the kind of engineering and design of vehicles. And so it's a very rich field in terms of, like I said, in terms of research depth and technical challenges. I think another exciting aspect of it is what we've talked about, which is the kind of interplay between space exploration and national defense. And so some of my projects, are funded by NASA, and we're thinking about flying hypersonic vehicles to, one of the moons of Saturn. And some of my projects are funded by the Department of Defense, when we're thinking about, how does radio blackout occur on hypersonic vehicles, and how can we prevent it? So it's a really broad and deep kind of technology area, and I'm going to say it's a lot of fun to work on. It's just intellectually challenging and stimulating. It's a lot of very cool stuff.
When they're at hypersonic speeds, is it radio blackout? Is that the default? Can it not communicate?
So it does depend. If you're coming back from the space station, for example, you would definitely have a period of radio blackout there. So what happens in that case is that the air that's around the vehicle gets heated up to very high temperatures. So that's kind of the unique part of hypersonics, is that the air flowing around a regular airplane just more or less stays at regular temperatures. But in hypersonics, it could get to be many thousands of degrees. So like it's the same temperature as the surface of the sun, which is crazy, right? So you have, and sometimes in the movies and things, you kind of see all this fire around, right? So that's real, and so what happens when air gets heated up to these super high temperatures is the molecules break apart, the atoms break apart, and you get this situation called a plasma, which is it's like air, but it's got electrons in it. It's got charged particles in it, and so it's the electrons in the end that cause radio blackout. So you're coming back from the space station. There's going to be 30 seconds of radio blackout. I don't know what it is, but something like that. 30 seconds of radio blackout. Everybody's cool about it. It's expected. It happens, and you come out the other side, and everything's fine. Again, going back to the national security aspect, if you have a missile, right, and it's flying hypersonic speed, and you cannot communicate with it, that's an untenable position, because let's say you decide to recall a vehicle or self-destruct it, right? It turns out these people aren't our enemies, and you've got to be able to communicate with it, and it's all done with radio waves, right? So it's very important to understand when that happens, and if it does happen, how to get around it.
So you work on defense, you work on this hypersonic technology. What else do you do?
So I'm a professor here at University of Colorado, and work with a bunch of grad students on hypersonics and also on space propulsion systems. So that's another interesting area where I mentioned plasmas just a little while ago. So plasma-based engines are being used and developed for more efficient space exploration and transportation. And at the university, I guess I have two roles. I have all that research part, and then I'm the director of a center looking at different aspects of national security technology development. So that's across a broad range of things.
And I definitely want to ask you a series of questions like about leadership and that, but you said something that intrigued me. What is plasma? Like, I know what it is in like a movie sense or whatnot, but like, what is plasma actually?
Well, so plasma is like a gas, right? And so, I don't know, if you think of like, at least in my high school chemistry, you would see like bromine gas or something, right? So think of a gas. And usually gases are just made up of molecules and atoms. And then what a plasma is that there are electrons and ions in there. So if you have an atom, if you have a hydrogen atom, it has one electron going around it. So if you somehow were able to pull that electron off of the atom, completely detach it, then what would be left is the ion, and you've taken away an electron. And so a plasma is a gas that has these ions and electrons in it. So that's what it is. It's very interesting because you can kind of manipulate plasmas using electric fields. You can kind of push them around. You can do things to plasmas that you can't do to gases because of the charges. And so plasma comes into a lot of different technologies because as humans and engineers, we can manipulate it more easily than just a regular gas.
What's the core like elements that we need to manufacture it?
Well, there's a variety of different ways, but heat will do it. If you just heat a gas up to high enough temperatures, like the thousands of degrees I was talking about for hypersonics, then the atoms and the ions, the atoms and the molecules just get so energized that an electron can pop off one of the molecules and it then becomes an ion, and then you have a plasma. And so that's the main way in the technologies that I work in. Yeah.
So the base material that you're heating up is what?
It would be a gas of different kinds. So
okay, gas of you can.
Yeah, exactly, directly from a gas. Yeah. So it's interesting. I was talking about space plasma propulsion there. So most of those systems use xenon gas.
Okay. Yep.
It just turns out that it's relatively easy to remove the electrons from xenon atoms. And
doesn't it start with an X? And that's kind of cool, right?
Starts with an X, right? It couldn't be any cooler than that, right? It's X-rated technology. Yeah.
There you go. Oh, that was good. All right, leadership stuff. Where did you get your leadership skills? Like, you're obviously very experienced, and you're running a department. You're a professor, and you're shaping the next generation of engineers and scientists and whatnot. Where did you acquire your leadership skills?
I think that was mainly through interaction with a part of the Air Force. The Air Force has something called a scientific advisory board. And so it's like it's a big group of like 50 people, very, very smart people from industry, other parts of government and universities. And so I was a member of that body for a few years, and I had the opportunity to lead what they call studies. So one of the main things that board does is study different topics for the Secretary of the Air Force. And so I had the opportunity to lead a couple of those studies, and I was the vice chair of the overall board. And yeah, I think I learned a lot in that process by talking to retired military people, like retired 4-star generals, who obviously get a lot of leadership training for their particular brand of leadership. But then there was also industry leaders and vice presidents and presidents. I mean, it was that kind of level of people, and it was just the mixing for me coming from a university, talking to military leadership, talking to industry leadership, just gave me really a lot of mentoring and an opportunity, to think about what I think is important in the end. Leadership is all about getting people to do stuff for you, right? And there's many different ways to do that in different environments. So I think if I have anything, that's where I got it from.
That's very immersion. You were just surrounded by it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I was learning stuff without even knowing it, but reflecting on it afterwards and thinking, that was interesting how that person took that approach.
If you could go back in time and give yourself a piece of advice at specifically the moment you graduated undergrad, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it would be to interact with people more. To really almost any conversation you can learn something from. right? Almost any person you can learn something from. And it's about being open to listening to them, and it's about, asking the right kinds of questions and taking an interest in them. So I think I didn't appreciate, the power of people, right? In the end, kind of one-to-one, just like this. And then taking that and then applying it to whatever different things you're trying to do. Yeah. So my undergrad degree was in math. It's a very introverted field. I think, if I'd realized earlier the power of talking to people, that's the advice I would have given.
I 100% back that. I don't know if I was so excited to talk about hypersonic technologies. My background, 17 years as a software engineer, started this podcast to share what I'd learned building teams of software engineers. And, I did a blog, a book, it turned into a podcast, and then it became my full-time job after like 200 episodes, because like sponsors and whatnot.
Yeah.
I was like an introverted software engineer. I mean, like I was a quiet leader, and I'd say the one thing that changed my life the most was after I got to like 100, 120 conversations. It's hard to even express, but getting to know someone and having a detailed conversation for an hour with like 100 different people is actually something super rare. Most people will say, yeah, I talk to a lot of people, but I'm not talking about the interaction of somebody like a store clerk. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about detailed conversation about something you both have a shared interest in, because then you learn how people work better, and it's fascinating. And then I found out after I got all excited about this that there's like a book called like Meet 100 People or talk. Somebody has a book out there. I was told it was fairly popular, but it has you go through these steps to do that, and I was like, that's a great book, because I mean,
well, if you don't do it your way, I think it's got to be pretty hard to do, right? You've got to really, how do you motivate 100 people to come talk to you in depth, right? I'm not saying it cannot be done, right? But it takes a lot of work. Yeah.
Well, the answer is simple. You have to have something of value to bring them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So early on, when I was checking my book, I found that. Before I published the book, I had these conversations, and then those turned into the podcast, right? But what I found was people that were responding to me were often people that were farther along in their career, and they were interested in sharing their experience and giving back. And so I realized, that's a category, that's an area of humanity that you can tap into in order to get information from people. It's just something humans do. So we focused a lot of our early episodes on doing that really well, and getting people to come on. It's like, I'm no expert. I bring smart people on and I ask them questions, and then that's valuable to the audience. And then sponsors want to be in front of the audience, and the cycle goes on, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's great. Yeah.
And I get to meet awesome people like you. Dude, you are fantastic.
Well, I'm enjoying the conversation with you, obviously. So this is great.
What haven't we covered that you want to get out there to the world?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that sometimes when I talk about hypersonics and it's on the national defense side, it sounds a little bit, doom and gloom. And I think that what I would want to emphasize again is, is what we often call the dual use or the multi-purpose. That yes, there's a lot of activity right now in hypersonics on the national defense side. And a lot of that is driven by what other countries are doing, right? The other person always gets a vote in what you have to do. But that there will be important spin-offs for, non-military applications, allowing us to do more and in-depth space exploration, as well as commercializing space. And really, one of the reasons why space has not become commercialized in the sense of building products in space is that it's so expensive and difficult to bring stuff back again, right? I mean, it's great that you've got zero gravity up there and you can build something, but the cost of bringing it back and the difficulty in that has kind of precluded companies really making, sort of closing the cycle, the budget cycle on producing stuff in space. Again, hypersonics is as we make progress with that and bring down the cost of materials and things, will enable things like that. So there's a lot of positive aspects to hypersonics that will benefit all of us.